Hi, this is Mrs. Nagayama, and this is a recording to help you with the semester final for Biology A. Please review the unit tests from Unit 1, 2, 3, and 4 before taking the final. The semester final has 15 multiple choice questions. Each question is worth 5 points, so the final is worth a total of 75 points. You can retake the final as many times as you need to. Once you are done with all of your tests, quizzes, and final, you can see what your final grade is. Retake any assignments until you are happy with your final grade. So let's go ahead and get started. How do animals get energy? This was from Unit 2. Animals get energy by eating food or plants. Plants give animals glucose. Animals, however, cannot use that glucose as a form of energy. So what animals do is they take the glucose and make ATP and use that ATP as energy. So again, we start with energy from the sun. Plants use that energy from the sun to make glucose. Animals will then eat that glucose. But because animals cannot use the glucose directly as energy, animals change the energy from the glucose and convert it into energy in ATP, which is a chemical that we can use for energy. So here's a sample question from the final. Which statement describes the manner in which an animal, such as a deer or rabbit, gets and uses energy? A. It eats plants and converts the sugar in plants into ATP by cellular respiration. B. It uses photosynthesis to convert the glucose in plants into ATP. C. It changes plants into ATP through protein synthesis. Or D. It seeks out plants that contain chloroplasts to make ATP. So let's revisit the previous slide. So we see that animals, how they obtain glucose is they eat plants and then they change that glucose into ATP, which is a usable form of energy. So the best answer for this one would be A. It eats the plants and converts the glucose or sugar in plants into ATP in a process called cellular respiration. All right, here's the next topic. What is the source of the instructions from which all proteins are made? So you can see here on the left that we have a cell, and in the middle of the cell we have a nucleus. Inside the nucleus we have DNA protected. The DNA is found in the form of chromosomes, which is basically tightly wound DNA. If we were to unravel those chromosomes, we would see that we would get DNA, and each section would be considered a gene. These genes are instructions in which all proteins are made. So here's a sample question. A person's skin cells and eye cells make different types of proteins to perform their functions. What is the source of the instructions from which all the proteins are made? Is it A, the mitochondria, B, genes, C, gametes, or D, ribosomes? The best answer for this one is B, genes. Remember, genes are sections of DNA that code for specific traits and proteins. All right, here's another topic we're going to go over. In a previous unit, we went over macromolecules. We know that there are 4 major macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Which 2 do you believe is used most often for energy? So out of these 4, there are 2 that we access more readily for energy, and that would be carbohydrates and lipids. So when you see this question and it asks you what 2 groups of compounds do living things most commonly use as an energy source, C, carbohydrates and lipids is the correct answer. In the later units, we talked about how our cells and our bodies develop. So as you guys all know, we all started off with just one cell where we had an egg fertilized by a sperm. But how did we go from one cell to having so many different types of cells? This is the process of cell differentiation. Remember, we start off as a zygote, which is a fertilized egg. That zygote will start multiplying, making these things called stem cells. Stem cells are really cool because they have the potential of making cells that have specific functions, and that's what we call cell differentiation, when stem cells produce different types of cells such as heart cells, skin cells, liver cells, and lung cells. So here's a sample question from the semester final. Shortly after a chimpanzee embryo begins growing, its cells begin to take different forms. Which statement best describes what is happening to those cells at that point in the chimpanzee embryo's development? Is it A, mitosis is making identical new cells from the original cells? B, differentiation is taking place to create cells with specialized functions? C, meiosis is making many different types of cells? Or D, cellular respiration is breaking down old cells to form new ones? If we look back at the previous slide, we see that cell differentiation is when we have cells becoming different and having a certain function that is different than other cells. So the best answer for this one would be B, differentiation is taking place to create cells with specialized functions. All right, and then kind of the last topic that we went over was genetics, and I just want to revisit the idea of phenotype versus genotype. Remember, phenotype is the physical appearance, and genotype are the alleles or the version of a gene that a person has. So for example, if we look on the left-hand side of this picture here, we see someone with blue eyes. Their physical appearance or their phenotype would be that they have blue eyes. Their genotype, or the alleles that that person have, would have two little b's. So that would be 2 genes for blue eyes. It says below that it's recessive and it's a lowercase b, and that's because it's the weaker version of the eye color gene. On the right-hand side, we see someone with brown eyes, so their phenotype or physical appearance would be brown eyes. The genotype, or the alleles that they have, could either be big B, little b, or big B, big B. And the reason why is because brown eyes are dominant. So even if someone had a brown eye gene from their mom and a blue eye gene from their dad, the brown eye gene would win out and you would only see brown eyes. Okay, so here's a sample question. Which statement describes the relationship between a gene and an allele? Alleles are made up of 2 different forms of genes. A gene can have different forms called alleles. C, many genes combine to form an allele. D, alleles are similar genes from different species of organisms. So if we go back to the previous slide, we see that alleles are versions of genes. So the best answer for this one would be B, a gene can have different forms called alleles. All right, and then the last topic, this was actually from our first unit, was the scientific method. So if you remember, we talked about the scientific method and how we start off with making observation and then asking questions. Once we kind of know the question that we want to ask, we can form a hypothesis, which is an if-then statement that we can test. When we figure out what we're trying to test, then we can then perform an experiment, then gather and analyze the data, and then lastly draw conclusions. When you draw your conclusions, you can decide whether your hypothesis was correct or not. After the hypothesis, after you draw your conclusions, you can then decide, do I want to change my hypothesis or form a new one? And then you can start a new experiment. Or if you do the same experiment over and over and get the same result, you can then communicate those results to the scientific community so that they can know of your findings. So here's a sample question. A scientist has just finished collecting data on the feeding habits of a certain species of ant. Which part of the scientific process should the scientist undertake next? Should it be A, the scientist should form a hypothesis, B, the scientist should make conclusions, C, the scientist should communicate the results, or D, the scientist should analyze the data? So the scientist here has collected the data, so that would be the same as gathering data. Immediately after gathering data, the most important part is to analyze the data. So the best answer for this one would be D, the scientist should analyze the data. So that concludes the last review video for this semester. If you want any resources, additional resources, please email me or contact me. Remember, you need a 60% or better in the class in order to pass. You can retake any quiz, test, or final as many times as you need to. in order to obtain the final grade of a 60% in the class to pass. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.